So how are policies designed to influence behavior? Policies designed to affect the costs and the benefits associated with certain actions. So the costs and the benefits, the motivation to influence people's behavior, right? So policies create incentives by utilizing a combination of 5 policy tools called the 5 Ps. Prescriptive regulations, payments, penalties, property rights, and persuasion. So the incentives could be positive or negative. The first P, prescriptive regulations. So this is basically the government's just make the regulations tell you what can be done and what can be done. Okay, for example, because the coronaviruses are rising very high now, and some of the states kind of roll out restrictions and the regulation. That's kind of a prescriptive regulation. Another example is this Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. So that serves the role, okay, to decide the average fuel economy standards for vehicles. The prescriptive regulations also apply to laws and the rules to establish water quality standards and some of the land use designations. I think that's quite straightforward to understand. Payments. This is a very straightforward picture, right? It involves something with money. A form of the payment could be subsidies, could be tax credits, could be tax reductions, could be research grants, contracts, and that is a positive incentive designed to encourage certain actions. For example, government pay tax reductions or tax credits to people, or just make a payment to the people willing to install the solar panels. So that's one example of the payments, and that is a positive incentive to encourage you to install the solar panels. And the permits, a government authorized permission to engage in behavior, such as a cap and trade, right? So you don't want your permit to be taken away because you do not abide by the laws. Penalties could be imprisonment. If you do not go by policy. It could be huge fines, such as the BP Deep Horizon explosion, right? That's a very big fine they pay because they do not they engage illegal activities or negligence. And the government can also use taxes as a negative incentive, right, to regulate probably the plastic bags or the gasoline use, etc. Property rights. As we saw with Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the government has a power of property rights that can drive a policy goal. And for example, in the 19th century, government turned millions of acres of public land into private land to spur economic growth through farming, mining, railroad construction. Also, the sulfur dioxide pollution, which contributes to the acid raining, right? The PM contamination from coal-fired power plants were turned into a property right by Clean Air Act. So that created a market for pollution allowance as part of the cap and trade system. So government declared those are their property and they have the rights to the property and they have the rules to the property. So everybody have to follow the regulations. Persuasion, that means give out information to influence behaviors. And the EPA disseminates this information to the public. So this is the toxic pollution. Okay, so this is the Emergency Planning and the Community Right to Know Act that require facilities using the 600 chemicals identified as toxic. They have to report their annual release to the air, land, and the water. And the EPA sort of publish those data so the public know who has the biggest release and who has the least release. That kind of pressure, use the environmental group to pressure the behaviors of those corporations, those companies, operations. All right, so how how did important environmental policies in the United States develop? And those policies can be divided to two broad issues. One is to control the pollution. The other is to manage natural resource impacts. And the pollution sometimes can become really bad. This is the people died because the air pollution in Pennsylvania. And it happened in the very unfortunate weather, which is a cold air sitting on the warm air. Okay, so the pollutants cannot diffuse away in such climate, and because of the coal-powered plants, and it emits a lot of toxic air pollutants. So many people died. By 1970s, pollution control laws resulted from the creation of the EPA. The Clean Air Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So I emphasize again and again and again. Around 1970, because EPA was founded and those important laws were made and carried out, that's why we have decent quality of air and water today. Those laws were made a long time ago doesn't mean they are outdated. Doesn't mean they should be rewritten or torn down. So what Trump administration was doing, that is not reasonable. And that is very harmful for our environment. And in 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. This majorly to explore the impact of DDT. That kind of pressure the government to make laws to get rid of some of the very nasty chemicals. So this is an example of some of the laws to control the pollution in the United States. And those are vitally important. I cannot emphasize more of the importance. And Rachel's work was marvelous and outstanding. Of course, she has this tremendous pressure from those from the chemical industry, from those chemical making companies, many of them kind of demeaning her and criticize against Rachel. And she has to testify and she has to defend her discovery in congressional hearings and on numerous news programs and in debates. And this is a huge fight. Okay, but she is courageous and she was not afraid and she won. So natural resource policy, we just talked about the pollution policy and the resource management policy. That start with the government ownership of the land. So the government owns 28% of the land mass, and 72% is left under the control of the states. Okay. And these are some of the laws protect the plants, animals, and natural resources, such as water, mountains, forests, and the Endangered Species Act is one of them to protect the animals, plants and animals. The last part is how to address the environmental issues on the international scale. So United States, China, Europe produce more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions. And contributing to sea level rise that threatens 52 small island nations. Wow. We have 200 nations, and this is a quarter of the nation. This is really serious. And the sovereignty. That means each country exercises their power within their boundary. But that also causes the challenges when dealing with the global environmental issues, such as greenhouse gas emissions. And I need to mention the intergovernmental organizations. Those organizations are formed by member countries to facilitate operation. And the United Nations is the largest IGO with 193 members and works in many ways to influence global changes. And the Sustainable Developmental Goals and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, you better remember IPCC and the United Nations, are current global initiatives related to the environment. I'm going to leave the last part to the next portion of the lecture.